Hello, we made it. It's the final week. Everyone give yourself a round of applause. We dwindled slowly, but you are the few who made it. Okay, hi everyone. My name's Alyssa. I'm part of the steering committee here at All Power Books. I help with both our media and political education efforts. And I'm going to let my comrade over here introduce himself and get us started.
Hey everyone, my name's Kyle. I'm also on the steering committee, and I help run our volunteer programming. So today we are finally finishing What Is to Be Done. We've learned a lot about what's wrong, right? And now we finally get to learn about what is to be done. So Lenin's going to take us from what's wrong and what he thinks we should do about it. So a quick recap of where we left off last week.
Size and Lenin.
We have our size and Lenin. He was calling out all the BS from all the other economists and people out there. And he doesn't stop doing that in these final two chapters, but we're going to start seeing some more concrete actions that he thinks are important. So just a quick review of sort of the key terms we chatted about before. The first is we talked about spontaneity, right? Which are strikes or protests that sort of happen, but don't have like an organized driving force behind them. We think these are necessary, but they're not enough, right? The second is terrorism, so just individual violence or adventurism, trying to blow up the Tsar, for example, which makes a loud scene, but also doesn't contribute to a sort of an organized, structured approach to changing society. And Lenin called this excitative terror, and it's just basically political theater, right? And then finally, we have economism, which was sort of the main critique Lenin was focused on. So economism being focusing purely on trade unionism politics and trying to create change just through the economic sphere alone, which, as we've discussed, we do not think is the right approach. Alrighty, so tonight we will be talking about three different parts. The crisis of amateurism, which is what Lenin will diagnose in chapter 4 primarily. And then we'll get to his solution, which is a party of professional revolutionaries, or the Vanguard Party. And then finally, we'll get into why he thought a national newspaper was, at the time, specifically the right strategy to fix the problems they were facing. And then we'll talk a little bit more about bringing that to today's period and what we think the right solution is. But let's quickly recap the historical context, right? So I know there's a lot of different names, like Martynov and different initials. Can be very confusing. So just to simplify it, just keep in mind, everyone is beefing, right? These are all just people sending broadsides back and forth at each other. And it all started in 1901 when Lenin wrote in Iskra, Where to Begin, which is his first draft of this idea of a national newspaper. He was looking at the spontaneous student and worker protests at the time, and he was thinking, we need an actual plan. And so then The Economist over at Rabochai
Diallo, I think.
That one.
I think.
They didn't like this, and so they released a series of articles in 1901 where they were criticizing Lenin's approach and saying he was trying to drive into the kingdom of shadows the existing local organizations. And then he wanted to replace real local work with a fantastic network of agents controlled by some out-of-touch editorial board. So Lenin took personal offense to that and does what he does best, and he wrote a whole pamphlet firing back titled What Is to Be Done. And this was his main clapback and what has made him very famous in history. So let's let Lenin cook. But first, once again, we're going to do another quick timeline. So 1894, the Webbs published a book about British trade unions. It's not super important, but Lenin does cite it later when he talks about trade union politics. In 1895, Lenin started the League of Struggle, and he got arrested in December and exiled. In 1896, there were massive textile strikes all over the country. One of the main results of this was the workday was shortened from 15 hours to 11.5 hours, which is still pretty shitty. And I think in a lot of ways highlights one of the challenges of economism, right, in terms of the realm in which it's fighting. 1898, the first Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was held in Minsk. Everyone declared themselves a party and then were promptly arrested. In In the 1900s, economism started to rear its ugly head. These newspapers started publishing from Geneva, and the ideas of economism started to become more prevalent. In 1900, Lenin got out of exile, founded Iskra, and then in 1901 is when all this back and forth started with the publishing of Where to Begin, the rebuttal to that, and finally Lenin's What is to be Done. So a key thing we want to take away from this timeline, though, is that the movement in Russia was growing massively, but these organizations kept getting crushed, right? And so Lenin, by publishing What is to be Done, is offering his solution for solving that problem. And I'll hand things over to Alyssa.
Okay, so now we're getting into chapter 4, the primitiveness of the economist and the organization of the revolutionaries, aka Lenin roasting the economists for like 40 pages. So he starts off the chapter by describing how young and up-and-coming revolutionaries were organizing in the 1890s, like we talked about. Basically, you have a bunch of students all discovering Marxism, getting hyped, and forming a group, but they have no connection to anyone who came before them, no contacts in other cities or even in like other parts of the same city. No plan, no strategy, they're just doing stuff. Leaflets, demonstrations, even some acts of terror. And then the police, who have been watching them this whole time and know who the movement leaders are, swoop in and arrest everyone, just leaving a couple behind that they call breeders, literally, so they can just keep going in and finding and arresting more revolutionaries. So what happens then? The organization shatters, right? Workers lose faith, and then a new group forms and does the exact same things, disconnected from all of the other movements before it. So here Lenin uses a metaphor comparing the students to peasants going to war against modern militant troops with only wooden clubs in their hand. So then we get into the beginning of the beef, and Lenin throws the first of his many punches at a guy named Vladimir Bazarov, or BV. All you really need to know is that BV is an economist, critic of Lenin, who writes for Roboche Diallo. And in one of his articles, he admits himself how bad the state of the movement is, right? There's a severe lack of revolutionary forces fit for action and a shortage of skilled agitators. These student organizers are only lasting like 4 to 5 months before getting arrested. So even the economists knew the movement was failing. They admit it outright. But the disagreement comes in because the economists look and they're like, we can just make some adjustments to make these groups a little more efficient and effective. But Lenin says, you see the failure with your own eyes. You just have the wrong ideas about how to fix it, and then calls their ideas primitive, throwing punches. So here is Lenin's definition of primitive methods. Can we get someone to read? Anyone? Hand? Don't be shy. Okay. I guess I'll do a run.
The term primitive methods embraces something more than a mere lack of training. It embraces the restrictedness of revolutionary work generally, the failure to understand that a good organization of revolutionists cannot be built up on the basis of such restricted work. And lastly, and most important, it embraces the attempts to justify this restrictedness and to elevate it to a special theory, i.e. subservience to spontaneity. That was Lenin.
Thank you. Yeah, basically what he's saying is it's one thing to be inexperienced, right? Like we've all been there, but it's another thing to turn that into a virtue. And that's what Lenin is arguing the economists are doing here. So this is where we get to the Webb's history of trade unionism. Lenin looks at the early stages of British trade unionism, and they weren't revolutionary. This was a reformist group. They were operating mostly legally, very different from what Lenin's trying to build, but he brings it up for a reason. In the early days, these unions were rotating every job, right? They were taking turns as treasurers. They didn't have any permanent officials. Extreme suspicion of central authority, right? And it failed. The unions weren't able to scale. They were repressed in lots of like legal manners. So eventually, as Lenin says, they realized the absurdity of this primitive democracy and switched up their tactics. So they created representative institutions. They hired full-time paid officials. And Lenin's point is that if even the conservative British unions who are operating in a liberal democracy and not a police state could figure this out, why are y'all so determined to stay stuck in this primitive stage? So this is where we start looking at like the leading revolutionary strategy of the time, and Lenin identifies two false shortcuts or directions that people lean towards instead of actually building a party. The first one is the economist or opportunist who just says, have the unions organize a general strike. And Lenin's like, we already did that, right? The 1896 strikes were huge, and all we got was a really small reduction in the workday, which isn't nothing, but you're not increasing political consciousness, right? There's no improvement in organizational efficiency. A general strike without a party just gets you small reforms, then you go home, and nothing fundamentally changes. So the second shortcut is the adventurist or the terrorist, which their whole thing is like, let's just bomb the czar. That'll do it. But Lenin's like, we did that too. Every bomb just got us, more executions of our leaders, more arrests, having to start over from the beginning. We're not actually developing the political consciousness of the people. It's just spectacle, repression, and then back to zero. So like we said before, he says that terrorism without organization is just political theater. So Lenin's point is that in both of these shortcuts, he missed the main task in front of them, which is to establish an organization of revolutionaries capable of maintaining the political struggle. So we've got another quote here. Why does Lenin argue that it's the main task? Lenin says, no revolutionary movement can endure without a stable organization of leaders maintaining continuity. The broader the popular mass drawn spontaneously into the struggle, the more urgent the need for such an organization and the more solid the organization must be. And such an organization must chiefly consist of people professionally engaged in revolutionary activity. So what does Lenin mean by a professional revolutionary? He goes into a lot of it throughout this text and later publications, but there's really like four main pieces you want to keep in mind. So first of all, the most obvious, revolutionary activity is their primary occupation, not a spare time hobby. Sometimes that means you're literally getting paid by the party, and other times it means you get your buddy Stalin to run a little bank heist for you. Ask about later. Whatever the methods, it just means revolution is your full-time work. Second, they're professionally trained in the art of combating the political police, so things like secrecy and evasion, they're technical skills that need to be developed, right? The Tsar's police were highly organized professionals. You can't put amateurs up against professionals and expect to win. And then third, and this is what we were just talking about, they reject the shortcut logic of both economism and adventurism. So they're not looking for one big strike or one dramatic assassination. They're looking to build an organization that can maintain energy, stability, and continuity in a years-long struggle. And then last, we don't really get into it in the text, in this text, but they emerge from the working class. They're not an external elite imposed on the workers from above. They're the most advanced layer of workers themselves. And Lenin says explicitly that distinctions between workers and intellectuals are utterly obliterated inside of the organization. So I know that Lenin is throwing a lot of shade here, but I think it's important to note that he's not just lecturing on his high horse, right? He's making an assessment from his own experiences and his own mistakes. So this is a big quote, but I think it's kind of the most important, or one of the most important of the chapter. So I am going to once again ask someone from the audience to read. We have a volunteer.
Let no active worker take offense at these frank remarks, for as far as insufficient training is concerned, I apply them and foremost to myself. I used to work in a circle that set itself a great and all-embracing task, and every member of that suffered to the point of torture from the realization that we were proving ourselves to be amateurs at a moment in history when we might have been able to say, paraphrasing a well-known epigram, "Give us an organization of revolutionists and we shall overturn the whole of Russia." And the more I recall the burning sense of shame I then experienced, the more bitter are my feelings toward those pseudo-social democrats whose teachings bring disgrace on the calling of a revolutionist, who fail to understand that our task is not to degrade the revolutionist to the level of an amateur, but to exalt the amateur to the level of a revolutionist.
Thank you. I know that was a long one. I really love that last line. I think it's really important. That our task is not to degrade the revolutionist to a level of amateur, but to exalt the amateur to the level of revolutionist, right? He's not hating on amateurs. He's saying we have to train each other up. Amateurism is where you start. The question is whether you stay there or you build something that can win. But The Economist had a bit of a problem with that approach. So.
Alrighty. So one of the main debates was on this idea of centralization versus anti-democratic tendencies, aka the first thing an anarchist says to you when you tell them you're a Marxist. But no, it's a central question, right? This idea of, do we have a centralized organization, or do we try and prioritize, a pure democratic approach to things? And so Lenin had a lot of thoughts on this idea.
We may have burnt out of meme energy part of the way through, so just use your imagination here.
Yeah.
Think Giga Chad, Marxist revolutionary group.
So a section of chapter 4, Lenin brings up this anecdote of a time he was talking with a random economist, and they had both read the same pamphlet, and they both had similar critiques in that they thought it ignored this issue of organization. And so Lenin, in his mind, is like, oh, we're on the same page here, right? But then as they discuss it more, the economist starts talking about strike funds and mutual aid groups and broad, open, legal workers' unions. And Lenin realizes that actually they're not on the same page at all. Because in Lenin's mind, he's talking about organization as this small, centralized, disciplined organization of professional revolutionaries. That's not to say that Lenin's against strike funds or mutual aid, but he's against confusing these as being a revolutionary organization. So in his mind, we need both, right? But they aren't the same thing. And actually, before the presentation started, I changed the O's on that side to zeros. So they actually are different memes. Surprise. All right. So round 2, Lenin claps back. So these economist newspapers start publishing all these articles accusing him of anti-democratic tendencies, and he's ready to strike back. So truly, this is just, imagine if Twitter existed back in the early 1900s. They're quite literally just quote tweeting each other. So we would love to do a little dramatic reenactment. Would anybody want to be Lenin, and would someone else want to be our economist newspaper? We got one hand over here. And then if we have a second
Who's our second
hand,
victim? There we go.
Hell yeah. All right, let's go.
And choose who you want to be.
Read them as true to the...
I want to be Lenin.
All right, you can be Lenin. You can be Lenin. You can be Lenin.
Yeah, you have to go first.
All right, I'll be Roubache. Lenin's demand for a centralized party of professional revolutionaries reveals dangerous anti-democratic tendencies. The working class must lead itself through its own economic struggle. Trust the workers, not some secretive general staff of intellectuals.
All this talk and all these resolutions about anti-democratic tendencies have the musty smell of that playing of generalship which is indulged in abroad. You're cosplaying revolution from a safe cafe in Geneva while we actually fight the Tsar's police. Girl, sit down.
Understood the assignment. That was incredible.
That's exactly how they sounded.
So anytime you're thinking about this, again, I know it gets really confusing when you see all the names, but it's just a bunch of beef.
Alrighty, so this gets to a central point, which is toy democracy versus real democracy. So the economists had this sort of idealist idea of how democracy should work, right? Open elections for committee positions, public continuous debate, and the ability to immediately recall leaders. And so Lenin calls this toy forms of democracy because he's saying we're not recognizing the context that we're operating in, which is a very autocratic state with a secret police. So for example, for that first point, if we do open elections for committee positions, that's impossible because the secret police will just arrest everyone once they're elected. The public continuous debate of all decisions, that just creates evidence for the police to use against you. And then immediately recalling leaders is just another example of having a meeting, everyone shows up in one spot, and then surprise, we get arrested again. So Lenin's sort of arguing we have to recognize the realities of the situation we're in and just what's practical about these demands for open democracy. And I'll just supplement this with an anecdote of I used to organize with DSA, and we would love to do these annual conventions and have tons of democracy and tons of debate about different points. And one challenge from that was it just created a lot of internal strife where different groups would now hate each other and just argue for months. And then because we weren't a democratic centralist org, once things were decided on, no one had to do it. So everyone would just not show up to what had been decided on. And so it was just all a huge waste of time, right? But I think it's a perfect example of like people wanting to do democracy but not acknowledging the practical aspects of it. So that's just to bring it to present day, not to knock BSA. Sorry. Okay. All right. We have another quote. Would anybody like to read this quote? You don't have to make it sound like Lenin. All right, we got a reader right here.
The only serious organizational principle is the strictest selection of members and the training of professional revolutionaries. Given these qualities, something even more than democracy would be guaranteed: complete comradely mutual confidence among revolutionaries.
And this is just trying to drive home the point of this is the world we're operating in, and we need to be professional, we need to be serious, and there's this idealized version that we're aiming for, but in the short term, we have to be practical. All right, so that first part was kind of talking about this idea of democracy, right? And so now we're gonna go more into centralization. So at the time, there were a lot of different local papers around Russia, each doing their own work. And Lenin had an issue with this. There were 4 specific problems he highlighted: unstable principles, lacking political significance, it's costly to revolutionary forces, and it was technically unsatisfactory. So let's go into that first one, unstable principles. This is just the idea that there's so many different newspapers. One group is saying one thing about an issue, another group is saying another, and so there's no cohesive, unified message across all of these. The second, political significance. Each local paper focused on its specific local issues, but none of them were taking a look at the national picture and connecting all of these issues and identifying the bigger picture, right? The third is that it's costly to revolutionary forces, which is mainly burnout. So all these people are working on these different projects. They're getting really tired, all struggling along on their own printing presses and doing their own thing, and people are burning out and just dropping out of the movement. And then finally, that it's technically unsatisfactory, and this is just the idea that these different papers, some would publish once a year, some would publish once a month. It's just a very erratic scheduling, and it's just too unreliable for a movement to build itself on. And just another anecdote, like I know all my comrades here found me super annoying because when I first showed up, I was always like, every month it's got to be on the same day, and I was just trying to like drive home scheduling, right? And that's just to make consistency, to make it easier for us to organize, so we don't have to always be thinking like, when should this event be? So Lenin's saying these defects aren't accidental; they're just the inevitable outcome of this scattered nature of local newspapers. So localism doesn't just happen to fail, it's actually structurally incapable of succeeding at a national scale. So the localist rebuttal to that would be, local newspapers are better than nothing. And that's true, right? It's important that we have local newspapers. But he says, do not restrict yourself to indisputable but too general statements about the usefulness of local newspapers. Have the courage also openly to recognize their defects. So yes, local newspapers can be useful. That's not the issue we're debating here. The question is more, can we overcome our current scatteredness and amateurness? And moreover, can we find the courage to admit when something isn't working? So now let's figure out what is working.
So his solution is an all-Russian political newspaper, which, like, Lenin is making an argument specifically that it was turned it off. There we go. That it was the right tool for the job under their specific conditions, right? Because, like we had talked about, it reaches every local group at the same time with the same information, so you're not getting that scatteredness anymore. You have one single editorial board, which means one political line, so people aren't just off doing their own thing. You've got one network that's serving the whole movement, so you're not having to constantly reinvent the wheel with every tactic and approach you do. And then it's also training correspondents who can then become skilled local organizers, right? Building up your skilled workforce. 5, a secretive network is obviously harder for the police to find. So there you're solving the arrest problem a little bit. And then finally, it shows how local struggles fit into a national strategy. So everyone isn't just like stuck roaming around in the dark around each other. And he specifically uses this analogy here, comparing a national newspaper to like the scaffolding set up around a construction site, because scaffolding is this like temporary, cheap, easy material that you put up to help guide you and set it up, and then you take it down when you're done, you throw it away. But you can't build the building without it. So in this analogy, the newspaper is, marking the contours of the structure, it's showing you what you're building, it's facilitating communication between the builders, like the revolutionaries and the workers, it's connecting local groups. He also brings in this other analogy about like bricklayers, where you lay a guiding line, right? It's a plan to help you build it brick by brick. So the newspaper isn't the final party, it's the tool to help build the final party. Bottom line, revolution cannot be spontaneous. It requires deliberate construction. We have, I believe, the final quote of the night. So I'll just do this one. On a national newspaper, the newspaper is not only a collective propagandist and a collective agitator, but also a collective organizer. I love this one so much. Basically, Lenin is highlighting 3 different functions of the newspaper as different archetypes within the collective experience of revolutionary society, meaning you have a propagandist who spreads the ideas and the theory, you have the agitator who calls and brings people to action, and then you have the organizer who's doing that party work, right? Coordinating people, building discipline, recruiting, giving the movement a common voice. And all 3 of these elements are equally important when it comes to building a movement that actually challenges power, right? If you're able to agitate and activate people, right? If you're able to do these like big spontaneous movements, but you don't have an organization, you're probably going to burn people out, right? And if you have propaganda, but you're not actually agitating people, you're kind of just a study group. And then if you have organization, but you don't propagandize and you're not agitating people, then you're kind of just a private club. So that brings us into a question for us now, which is, what is our equivalent of Lenin's newspaper, right? What medium or media do we think can simultaneously agitate, propagate, and organize the working masses? And I don't know about you, I don't know, like, is there even a single tool or medium out there that does all of those functions effectively now? Like, we all know that media has become so spread out and decentralized. What does it look like in today's context? So on that note, actually, do you have something? I think we can do a quick throw of hands if people just have like, what platforms do you think of today that, oh, thank you. Or you can just shout it out really loud. We're gonna do this. Rapid fire here. We're just starting. We'll talk about this more in small breakout groups, but I just kind of want to hear from everyone. What mediums, what forms of media do you think of today when you're using them as like organizing tools that hit all 3 of those functions? Throw a hand up, don't be shy. Oh, come on, you started it.
I did start it right. No, I know. Great, thanks. I love being
There's
put on the
so
spot.
many, guys.
No, I know, there's so many. I do think you could say social media broadly. I think one of the issues and why I was so hesitant is if anybody here has played Metal Gear Solid 2, sorry. No, it's the deluge of information is almost harder to overcome than the lack of information nowadays. Like back then it was, oh, we got to get this newspaper out. Now it's like, how do we cut through the noise? Like,
Right.
It's a different story altogether.
And you're hitting a great point, because the conditions today are very different, and it creates a lot of unique challenges. Do you have one?
Yeah, we were talking about this in the car over here. It's like we can make a social media page or whatever, but like we don't own the means of the of production for that. Like that is like some corporation that runs Instagram or TikTok or whatever, and they can always just shut us down,
Right.
or use our data to like locate us or whatever. So yeah, it's not. Maybe it is just a newspaper. I don't know.
So we're getting into we're already kind of hitting the meat of it, which I think we have some questions set up to help us get there. So I'm gonna break us out into groups now, and we're gonna start talking about this question a little more. I encourage you to like initially just start throwing out ideas and names of platforms and channels, and then start to explore like where the complications are with that. But again, some great points have already come up that I think are really relevant.
And before we break into small groups, just an ask for the comrades is when you're in those small groups, just share space. And if you see someone isn't talking, like ask what their thoughts are, give them space to chat. These are ideally forums for everyone to be able to discuss. So just be cognizant of that as you're discussing.
Cool. Okay, we're gonna give this first question a good I don't know. What's that? It's hard to. We're a little smaller tonight. I'm thinking probably like groups of 5, a couple groups of 5 people, if that adds up. My math's not great.